Okay, lots of developments happened in Ukraine in the past 2 days. 4 regions declared that they want to join the Russian Federation after a referendum. Zelensky signed a decree saying that he wants to join NATO for the second time. Currencies are collapsing, energy crisis, etc. But let's wrap up all together and put these issues into a proper context. Now, let's start from 2014. In 2014, the United States engineered a coup d'etat, self-confessed, in Kiev and installed an ultranationalist government. The new Ukrainian government unleashed a campaign of discrimination and racism against the ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking people, and even the Gypsies. Now, against all odds, the people of these regions felt threatened by the fascist government in Kiev. And with the backing of Russia, they carried arms and defended their existence. While Donetsk and Lugansk declared independence in 2014 after referendums, and Crimea joined the Russian Federation also after a referendum because it was too important for Russia to keep the status of the peninsula vague, as Crimea represents the access of Russia to the Black Sea, to the Azov Sea, and also to the Mediterranean. These referendums and whether joining Russia or declaring independence, weren't recognized by the Western world as legitimate. Now, during this period between 2014 and 2020, the conflicting sides agreed on an agreement called Minsk Agreement. There were two parts of it, Minsk Agreement 1 and Minsk Agreement 2. This is the Minsk Agreement, okay? And unfortunately, this agreement wasn't implemented, especially by Kiev, which voted to recapture these areas, Donetsk and Lugansk, by force. And there are so many videos you can watch about the former presidents and leaders of Ukraine, including Zelensky himself, who mobilized forces to capture these areas. So what did this Minsk agreement basically say? The core of the issue was that the agreement consisted of a package of measures, including a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front line, release of prisoners, constitutional reform in Ukraine, granting self-government to certain areas of Donbass, and restoring control of the state border to the Ukrainian government. So based on this agreement, if you want to see the, as we say in Arabic, the butter of the issue, I think it is, for Russia, it's the constitutional reform in Ukraine, granting self-government to certain areas in Donbass. And for Ukrainian side are the other clauses of this agreement. So what these constitutional reforms mean? That they need to give more autonomy to the people of this area who are ethnic Russians or speaking Russian. On the other hand, Russia also accepted the return of these regions into the Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian authority if Ukraine grants this some sort of an autonomy or self-government for this area. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, this agreement wasn't implemented, and it led to lots of bloodshed in the eastern part of Ukraine. Over 13,000 civilians and armed rebels died during this period, during the infighting between Ukrainian forces and the Azov battalion against these Russian-backed rebels there. Now, 8 years after this agreement, Russia launched a special military offensive. And I will just show you the map. Okay, this is the map. So Russia launched a special military offensive and captured large swaths of not only Donetsk and Lugansk, but also Zaporizhia and Kherson. And excuse me if I'm butchering the pronunciation or the spelling of these cities and areas. Now, in mid-September, which means like just 2 weeks ago, the Russian side declared partial mobilization, calling around 300,000 new soldiers to Ukraine, while at the same time, NATO is still sending heavy arms to the country. Now, less than 2 weeks after this partial mobilization, the governorates of these 4 regions, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, they hold a referendum and they decided to join the Russian Federation. The votes were overwhelmingly in favor of Russia. The votes were over 92% in favor of joining Russia. Now, there are two questions, very important questions here. Are the referendums legal? And were the referendums transparent? I think these two questions are quite instrumental for us to understand the nature of the conflict there. Now, the Russian side argues that the people of these regions have the right for self-determination and they voted to join Russia. On the other hand, NATO says that the territorial integrity of Ukraine is sacred and these regions cannot be splitted and join any other country or become an independent for themselves. So we have here two concepts, self-determination and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. But what is the definition of self-determination? Self-determination basically means self-determination denotes the legal right of people to decide their own destiny in the international order. Self-determination is a core principle of international law, arising from customary international law, but also recognized as general principle of law and enshrined in a number of international treaties. For instance, self-determination is protected in the United Nations Charter and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as a right of all people. Now, the scope and purpose of the principle of self-determination has evolved significantly in the 20th century. In the early 1900s, international support grew for the right of all people for self-determination. This led to successful secessionist movements during and after World War I, World War II, and laid the groundwork for decolonization in the 1960s. Now, contemporary notions of self-determination usually distinguish between internal and external self-determination, suggesting that self-determination exists on a spectrum. Internal self-determination may refer to various political and social rights. By contrast, external self-determination refers to full legal independence, secession for the given people from the larger political legal state. So this is in short the definition of self-determination, but the most important part here, they are distinguishing between internal and external self-determination. And I will come to that and I will explain to you. I also wasn't aware of it. Internal self-determination is when your country is occupied by a foreign power, so you're colonized, and you decide that the self-determination of the people is to get free from the colonizer or to separate some parts of this country that is colonized and become independent. Now, external self-determination is when your country isn't colonized, but there is certain community or people who feel like they want to become independent and they want to decide they want to determine their fate, right? So which one is legal and which one is not is still somehow vague and still being discussed between the scholars and experts on international law. However, I came across a research study that is speaking mainly about the Crimea case and when Crimea did a referendum and joined the Russian Federation. And I think, maybe I'm mistaken, but I think the same case applies to Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. If it applies to Crimea, I think it also applies on these 4 other regions. So let's brace ourselves and go to this research because it's very important, and I went through this article and read it carefully, and I think it's worth from us to discuss. The choice between self-determination and territorial integrity is one of the oldest false dilemmas of international law. So it sets the problem of secession under 2 contradictory and mutually exclusive options, neither of which is true as such under positive international law. The story goes as following. Either a specific group within a state constitutes a people and has a right to external self-determination, or the territorial integrity of the parent state must be respected and prohibits secession by such group. But just before I go to the details, I just want to mention who wrote this article, because it's important also to know the author. Okay, so the author of this research is Theodore Christakis. He's a professor of international law, director of the Center of International Security and European Studies at the University of Grenoble Alpes. And he's being critical of both sides, by the way, and I like that. So I don't think it's like a propaganda or research. So the dilemma is very convenient from a political point of view. It provides states with the opportunity to ride two horses at the same time without being accused of holding a contradictory discourse. States could thus embrace self-determination of some groups to support in one way or another separatist claims compatible with their interests. The massive Western, for example, support for Kosovo's independence from Serbia is a good example of this. While proclaiming that the principle of territorial integrity prevails at home or in the territory of friends and allies. So he's explaining the hypocrisy or the double standards of the states. The case of Crimea highlighted these contradictions once again. Russia, which for years was a big champion of the principle of respect for territorial integrity of states, especially during the 90s when it was fighting the separatist attempts of Chechnya and Tatarstan, suddenly started claiming that the principle of self-determination of Russian-speaking populations in Crimea prevails over the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Western states, which constantly supported sometimes these technological things are a little bit annoying. So the Western countries, on the other hand, yes. So they supported in one way or another the Kosovo separatist movement since 1998, and which recognized Kosovo just a few hours after the declaration of independence on February 17, 2008. And they suddenly discovered, because of the crisis in Ukraine, the merits of the principle of territorial integrity and other basic principles of international law, often violated by these same Western states during these last years. Indeed, before focusing on this article in Russia's contradictions and argumentation impasses in relations with the crisis in Crimea, it is worthy to remind the inconsistencies and double standard policies used by some Western states, as Marcela Cohen put it, writing about the events in Crimea. Are the accusers being consistent? They are the ones who encouraged the secession of Kosovo by any means, who supported the secession of South Sudan, who used force without Security Council authorization and conducted a policy that led to the de facto fragmentation of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. When the Kosovo parliament declared independence, those same governments affirmed that the violation of the Serbian constitution was irrelevant and that international law didn't prohibit in unilateral declarations of independence. Vladimir Putin's government is paying them with the same coin. Contradiction in international policy and disregard for international law when it suits the interests of one side or another come at price. Western capitals have been left helpless against Russia, not militarily or economically. They have been morally helpless by dint of ignoring the basic rules governing international relations and invoking spurious legal arguments or claiming that the actions in question didn't constitute precedents, by dint of promoting the breakup of states, imposing a culture of force in international relations. Those who claim to represent democratic values on the international stage have ended up weakening the framework of international law and the system of collective security. Now, could the Crimean crisis and the reactions it has prompted in the West with very forceful reminders of their attachment of international law signal a change of tack. It was a relief to hear the US representative to the UN Security Council so vigorously reiterate the support of her government for the principles of the United Nations Charter, exactly 11 years after the unlawful intervention by the US and the UK in Iraq, an intervention that deeply and lastingly destabilized that country, and barely 9 months after the US stated that it was prepared with France to violate those same principles by attacking Syria without Security Council authorization. So he says that in this article, we will not discuss further these contradictions of Western states, which are, of course, very interesting, but irrelevant in order to assess the events in Crimea from a legal point of view. Indeed, two wrongs do not make a right, and the violation of international law by certain Western countries in other cases hardly entitles Russia to violate international law by infringing Ukraine's territorial integrity. We will not examine either as such the political events in Kiev that preceded the secessionist crisis in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and especially the demonstrations in Maidan Square during the winter 2013-2014. It was well known that Russia protested on several occasions about what it saw a Western interventionism in Ukraine's internal affairs, which explained Russia claimed the reactions of the Russian-speaking people in the country after the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych. Whatever the truth in these allegations, an eventual Western interference in Ukraine's internal affairs cannot be corrected by an unlawful military intervention by Russia against that country. Finally, we will not discuss here the extent of which the Crimean crisis is a form of Russian revenge against the West for Kosovo for the second time after the events of August 2008 and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and against the unfortunate Western attempts to present Kosovo as a sui generis case constituting no precedent for international law. In this article, we will focus instead on the relevance of the principle of self-determination and the Crimean conflict. In the Crimean conflict, we will try to show why the dilemma between self-determination and territorial integrity is a false one. On the one hand, there is no right to external self-determination and unilateral secession for any people. This is very important. On one hand, there is no right to external self-determination and unilateral secession for any people or ethnic group outside the colonial context. But while secession is not authorized by international law, neither is it in principle prohibited by the principle of territorial integrity, save in the event of violation of a fundamental rule of international law, which raises the crucial issue of the unlawfulness of the Russian military intervention in Crimea. So we will just go through this part as well, and I think that's enough for us to understand the difference between the internal and the external self-determination. In its official declarations in relations with the situation, in its official declaration in relation with the situation in Crimea, Russia argued several times that the people of Crimea had the right to self-determination, external self-determination. Russia's representative in the Security Council thus declared, through a free referendum, the people of Crimea have fulfilled what is enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and a great number of fundamental international legal documents, their right to self-determination. There were so many, I would say, incidents and statements in this regard, but let's not go through them all. However, this doesn't seem to be correct in positive international law. In principle, there is no right to external self-determination outside of the context of decolonization. The historical and moral claims raised by Russia in relation with Crimea and are thus not relevant. Indeed, it is interesting to highlight that till recently Russia shared this view according to which there is no right to external self-determination in the post-colonial world. As for the theory of remedial secession presented by some as exceptional right to external self-determination, it seems controversial, and in any event, it is not applicable here. So This part is also very important. I will just read the first few parts. External self-determination and saltwater test. Let us begin by emphasizing that obviously the question of lawfulness of secession doesn't arise when the secession is the outcome of a consensus-based process between the central government and the inhabitants of a specific region. International law has thus little to say about, for instance, the referendum that took place in Scotland on the 18th of September 2014, and which was organized on the basis of an agreement between Scotland and the United Kingdom. The real question of interest to us is whether such a secession is lawful from an international law point of view when the central government is opposed to it, as in Ukraine. Is there then a right of unilateral secession, a right of external self-determination? Current positive law, as developed since the UN Charter was adopted, reserves the right of external self-determination to colonized people. This right more specifically concerns peoples living in two types of territories, and I'm not going through this now. But I think this is very interesting to see and compare it with the case of Crimea and Kherson and Donetsk and Lugansk. Of course, the Russian side has a historical context, has a moral context, and also referring to the double standards of the Western side. On the other hand, the international law reserves the right for self-determination to colonize people. So there is this, I would say, it's very contradictory to speak about the legality of the issue. However, the main argument that anti-NATO camp raises in this regard on the legality of the separation is, why is it allowed for the US and its allies to violate international law and encourage separatism while it is not allowed for us? There is either international law that applies on all and everyone respects, or there is not. That's why nowadays many nations around the world are seeking to replace the unipolar international system to a multipolar one, because in the past decades, as also this professor argued, unfortunately, the Western world so there is this legitimacy, right, for international law that everyone has to respect and they follow. But when the stronger parts aren't applying these laws on themselves, how can you expect others to follow these laws, right? So it becomes a jungle. So whoever wants, and there is nobody that forces people to follow international law, because the even UN Security Council is comprises of 5 nations, and each side is there's a big polarization, and Russia and China can veto any let's say draft resolution from the Western side, and the Western side can do the same for Russia and China, right? So it's not an independent body that is forcing these laws on nations and the peoples of the world. So if one side has violated these laws for a long time, for decades, and changed borders, encouraged separatism and division among the countries, why other countries wouldn't do that, especially in regards to Russia, that has a big history in eastern Ukraine and Ukraine in general, because they were part of the Soviet Union and there are ethnic Russians living there, and they are also targeted to persecution by and exclusion and racism against them, right? So from the moral point of view and from the historical point of view, Russia can justify it. From the legal point of view, it's different, and I explained that to you. Now, were the referendums transparent? This is another important case. First, I will show you. Okay, so Craig Murray, in the past videos I also mentioned him. He's a former British diplomat and ambassador, and he's, by the way, critical of the NATO intervention in Ukraine. He believes that the referendums aren't transparent because they were held in areas under Russian military control, and the other side didn't have a chance to campaign against the referendum. And I think theoretically is correct, but practically speaking, when we see, for example, this map, and this map represents the voting process or the voting outcome in the 2010 elections when the people of Ukraine voted Yanukovych to power. And as you can see, the vast majority of these areas that are nowadays under Russian control, they voted for the pro-Russian Yanukovych. And the estimates are between 70 to 90% of the people in this area. So if I'm going to be critical, I would say to Russia, if the results aren't 92 to 98% in favor of joining Russia in the last referendum, I would say it is probably between 80 and 90% of the votes. And these areas, as I mentioned, were targeted by the Kiev government for a very long time, and they were asking for protection from Russia, and then they voted to join the Russian Federation. Now, personally, I think the West will never recognize the results of these referendums, and they will never recognize that these regions joined the Russian Federation, and they will say that the territorial integrity of Ukraine must be respected, etc. But the real question remains, what can the West practically do in this regard? First, they don't want a direct confrontation with Russia. And at the same time, I don't think they can economically survive a 10-year war, for example, in Ukraine. How long can they survive? You can see the currencies are crumbling, especially the euro in Japan, the Korean, etc. The allies of the United States are suffering, and they can't economically survive for a 10-year war. So, on the other hand, Russia can. And this is, I think, also the difference between the East and West. I think more people in the East are ready to die for their nation than in the West. And this is just my subjective opinion. But these referendums also, in my opinion, brings an end to the Russian special military operation, as it calls, right? Moscow calls it like that. But I think this operation has become to an end, the special military operation after these referendums that led to the separation of 4 regions and joining to Russia. And what comes next is either American submission or direct military war. And don't forget that in these areas, in these 4 regions that joined Russia, some parts of these regions are still under Ukrainian control. So from the Russian point of view, or from the Russian legal perspective, the constitution-wise, they will consider these areas as Russian occupied territories by Ukraine, and they will unleash a huge retaliation on them if they don't retreat from these areas. So from the Russian side, they see these territories as Russian territories, and from the Ukrainian side, they see it as a Ukrainian territories, but the legality of the matter has changed from the Russian side. So if an attack, for example, happens on these areas from the Ukrainian side, it will be considered an attack on Russia. And the reaction and the retaliation will be different, and it could also lead to CSTO intervention, because one of the member states of this organization has been attacked. So these were my humble analysis and commentaries of what happened in the past 2 days in Ukraine. I have did research for you, and I am sorry that this legal part was a little bit long, but it was important for us to understand what's happening from the legal side, from the political side, from the hypocritical side, etc. So that was all. I've been your host, Kirill Kalmasyan of Syriana Analysis. If you like my content, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. It's really great help. And also special thanks to all the supporters of Syriana Analysis who are supporting me financially, whether through Patreon, whether becoming a member of Syriana Analysis, the membership on YouTube, and also through PayPal. I'm really grateful for you guys. Thank you so much for your consistent support. All the links, by the way, in the description below in case you want to support. And without you, I don't think I can continue, because it's really important to have certain financial stability to make to spend so much hours reading, making summaries, notes, and then bringing you this content. I'm just the one person working on this channel with everything: research, writing the script, recording now and then editing and publishing. Anyways, see you next time.